Namaste everyone. Welcome to part one of the five-part series brought to you by Swaraja on a new idea of India. Episode one is presented jointly by Bharat Varta and Swaraja. With me today, I have the authors of the book, Harsh Gupta and Rajiv Mantri, whose views you've seen and heard on both platforms on topics around politics, economics, and policy. So without further ado, let's get started. Hi Harsh, hi Rajiv. Thanks so much for making the time. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good. Doing very good as you can under this present situation.
All right. So I can't wait to get started. And maybe a good place to start would be, why you wrote this book at this point of time. One of the first things you talk about is tracing the genesis of the book. You trace it to 2013 when the Mint newspaper initiated a debate on political philosophy, right? And specifically to a comment by Professor Ashutosh Varshney. So would you want to take us through that?
Raju, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. So, as if you read the book, Roshan, you would have noticed. So it started with when Varshney had commented. Yeah, so let's just hold up the
Sure.
book and
like a mandatory book photo, right?
Yep.
There you go.
Yeah. So when Ashutosh Varshney had said that individuals have a right to exist, or rather, they exist in groups, and I think he had said something to the effect that those group identities supersede the individual identity. I remember discussing with Harsh that time that this was the fundamental schism where do you believe individuals are just members of a group, or are they individuals? Are they sort of are there sub identities within those groups? So then we sort of picked up that point, and then we sort of argued for the case that individuals should be seen not as members of a group but as individuals. And I think that gets to the heart of the debate between what is the idea of India versus what we propose to be a new idea of India.
Right. So this was back in 2013. Harsh, you want to talk about what has happened from that time to up until now, leading to the release of the book?
Yeah, sure. So basically, I've known Rajiv since 2009. And I think we started co-authoring in 2009 or 10, a few columns every now and then. I think we co-authored about 50 columns together, mostly for Mint, also for Pragati, Swarajya, Indian Express, and separately also we've written many other columns for Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, so on and so forth. And especially after this 2012-13 and then onwards debate that you mentioned, first between ourselves and Professor Ashutosh Varshney, then actually in the Indian Express op-ed pages, the current Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman joined on our side, and Javed Anand joined on the side of Ashutosh Varshney. More people joined, including Jagannathan, R. Jagannathan, who's now the editor of Swarajya. And we then there was when Swarajya magazine was launched, the inaugural cover, the title piece was actually called A New Idea of India, and it was co-authored by me and Rajiv, and it was launched in Goa, I believe, by Sri Sri, the spiritual guru. And it just kind of all fell together. And then of course Narendra Modi won 2014, then he won 2019, and around 2017 or 18 our initial idea was, let's just kind of put all these columns together as an anthology and publish it, because people, even if you build a website, people don't really go to columns. It kind of gets lost after some time. Once we were doing that, we realized that a lot of the content was very old, especially 2012, 2011 was just outdated. And so we started, okay, let's tweak it a bit. Let's just upgrade it without making it anything else. And then we kind of just fell deeper and deeper and deeper into it. And then it was just became frustratingly longer and longer. And then it became an entirely new book.
Right.
So, if I'm my suggestion to anybody who is trying to write an anthology, please don't. If you have any quality standards, because you'll end up writing a new book.
Right.
You'll just waste some. I'm just kidding. I'm just saying the idea was actually not to write a book. The idea was just to put our columns in one place, maybe slightly updated, but then it became an entirely new book. And I think 2019, the re-election of Narendra Modi, and then the things he did with 370 CA, the things he's talking of doing, and a lot of stuff happened on the economic side as well, which people kind of dismiss it because we're not seeing high growth right now. And there was a time when 2019 we were writing it, we were discussing, are we writing faster, or is this new administration after confident second majority changing things faster? And I think finally under coronavirus, we got some time because, Rajiv and I have been in different cities and countries, continents for the last 10 years quite often. And actually this pandemic kind of gave us an opportunity within the same city. That also accelerated the process of actually finishing the writing in the first half of this year, middle of this year. So that is the kind of genesis of the book. Building on what Rajiv said,
Right.
in terms of how we actually wrote the process and how it came about.
Right. So the book is called A New Idea of India, and no pun intended, it has a lot of ideas, right? Both talks about old and new ideas. Let's talk about the importance of ideas themselves, right? I mean, you had this video on your social media handle, a scene from Devil Wears Prada the other day, which illustrated this fantastically well, right? So Rajiv, you want to talk about that because people might feel that, hey, this is, this highbrow idea, philosophy, all of these things, they don't really matter to me. I'm just living my life on an everyday basis. How does any of this conversation really pertain to me or, impact me in any way? So you want to talk about that?
No, so on the one end of the spectrum, you have high level political philosophy, and at the other end of the spectrum, you have retail politics, electioneering and retail politics, right? So and for a voter, most of the time they are seeing retail politics. So it's hard to make the connection between the big ideas and what follows much further downstream as retail politics. But that doesn't mean that ideas don't matter. I often sort of have sort of kind of conversations with friends who are more cynical. They're like, "हाँ ये सब तो ठीक है, पर कौन ये सब बात करता है? Who's talking like this? Who thinks like this?" And so on and so forth. But if you trace back from retail politics one step further back into policy making, which is what a government does, and then go a few steps further back, then you run into these big debates about individual freedom, about group versus individual rights, liberal markets versus state control. So somewhere when we experience that retail politics, we are living the result of the bigger ideas. When we interact with or experience in a negative way also the results of government policies, we are sort of living the experience of those very high level ideas which seem abstract. So that connection, even though it seems abstract, over time it is not something which should be dismissed.
Right.
There is a very good quote by John Maynard Keynes, just to add to Rajiv's point, and I'll just quote it for the viewers. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years ago. And you can extend this kind of thinking from economists to political philosophers to religious leaders. The ideas, the realm of ideas matters a lot, even to people who think they're unaffected by it. Because ultimately, you might not explicitly follow some ideas, but implicitly you're always following some ideas. And, an interesting point there is when people say, well, demographics is destiny. Yes, to some extent it is. But on an even longer time scale, actually, demographics is not destiny. I mean, to the extent anything is predestined, perhaps it's not. It's what ideas are going to really matter, because you can have children and then your children might not believe in your ideas, or maybe your grandchildren or great-grandchildren won't. So the battle for ideas is ultimately the most important battle. But as Rajiv said, it's a spectrum. So if you're in retail politics, then things probably don't move fast enough for that battle to be worthwhile from that domain point of view. So yes, for a 5-year cycle or even shorter cycle, the idea thing is probably looking static.
Right.
But over a generational or longer time frame, maybe much less so.
Right. So let's talk about the level at which these ideas have to be debated, right? And are being debated. I would say, political would be the lowest level of abstraction, right? So where you say that, hey, I mean, I want X done or Y done, and so I'm going to vote for X or Y, or I'm going to talk about the pros and cons of something of that sort. You could, abstract a level higher and say cultural, and then a level higher and philosophical, and then a level higher, maybe spiritual, and whatever other realms you can find, right? So at what level are you talking about these ideas, and how do you see that linking down, and how do you see that trickle down to the base level, and actually being actions and reality someday?
So I think we actually write about that in the book. I think it's in the first chapter itself. If I'm not
Yes.
wrong. There is we say at the top level there is psychological, which is similar to what you were saying in terms of spiritual. After psychological, we say there is philosophical. And after philosophical, we say there is like a policy level, if I'm not wrong. And only after policy level is there a partisan kind of
Right.
level. And we are not saying that this is somehow hierarchical in the sense that partisan level is somehow less important or somehow less noble. It's just a way of putting a pyramid, but that in many ways, it doesn't matter what your abstract ideas if you're constantly losing, right? So that is one way of thinking about it. And just to add one point before I hand it over to Rajiv on this interaction or this kind of reflexivity between retail politics and ideas, I think there's another reflexivity, which is that ideas are not exogenous. So like ideas shape political power, societal destinies, or economic realities, but those things in turn shape ideas.
Correct.
So and the reason why that is important is because if today there is a certain amount of confidence, even India is still per capita poor, right? It's still only $2,000 per income, but there is still nonetheless, and it's very cliche, but there is a sense of we are at an inflection point, right? There is a sense of something big possibly on the horizon, and that confidence that we might actually belong to the top league in turn allows us to have a different set of ideas, because what changes is your attitude, your confidence, right? If you're open to the world, some sense of the Overton window of ideas that make sense to you is different. And if you're naturally defensive or guarding against the world, then a different set of ideas make more sense, right? So in that sense, you're actually not discussing ideas. It's actually the attitude that you've already kind of pre-chosen, and then the ideas fall into your lap. So I'll leave it there and kind of let Rajiv handle the original question that you asked.
It's also fairly circumstantial, I would say, right? I mean, I think Claire Lemon put this quote out early, I think a few months back, that I'm a libertarian in the normal context of things, but hey, I mean, call me whatever, call me leftist or communist or whatever, but when we're under the grips of a pandemic as we are at this point of time, I mean, I favor more of those ideas. Rajiv, you want to continue from where Harsh trailed?
No, so ultimately, how do we see ourselves? That is the big question. And how you sort of see yourselves as a country, as a society, is dictated by circumstances. Now, those circumstances are actually shaped by what previous governments did, what this government is doing, and so on. So to Harsh's point on reflexivity, so in a way, if you don't take a step back and just presume that past is prologue, then you get kind of stuck in that. You'll be stuck in a rut. But it's important to ask, how did we get here? Why are we here? And if we don't like where we are, how do we change? So that is where the ideas part, I think, becomes really critical, because then people have to think of alternatives. So if we don't like how this path or this kind of trajectory has landed us in this particular state, how should we change course? So and then you get into debating ideas that, okay, so if we had too much government intervention in the economy, what is the alternative? How should we restructure? How should we reform? And then similarly, in the realm of society and other kinds of issues, social issues and other kinds of topics where policy making becomes critical. And then as a ultimately, that's the beauty of democracy, right? Where if there is a certain dissatisfaction in society, someone new comes along and says, wait, I'm offering this, which is different from this. And really that alternative is clarified by ideas. That differentiation comes from the difference of high level ideas.
Right. So you cover about 5 broad themes in the book. Harsh, you want to talk about how those themes are laid out?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the five broad themes I think also correlate to the five chapters that we have,
Yeah.
besides the introduction and the conclusion. I think the first theme is that India is not just a post-colonial entity. Yes, there is obviously a Union of India. There is a Republic of India post 47, post 1950, post 1952, the first election. But India is a much more ancient civilization entity, and that the reason why that matters is something we can discuss later on, because it deals about national identity, about political legitimacy, and issues of constitutional morality versus civilization, and if they're at all orthogonal to each other. So the first thing is, we are much older. We discuss in that chapter that it's nation and civilization are technically different terms, and maybe we were not fully a nation, we are nation building, but nonetheless we've always been a civilization. So that's chapter one. I think chapter two is about saying that chapter two and three is about discussing broadly the issues of who are we, what does secularism and liberalism mean, how do we save secularism from secularists? That's the name of chapter three.
Yeah.
We discuss all these isms to some extent about these questions of identity, right? And so that's chapter two and three. And chapter four and five are much more about economics and governance and state capacity. So we're saying, okay, fine, as the subtitle of the book goes, individual rights in a civilizational state, right? So the individual rights and civilizational part are kind of covered in chapter 1 to 4, but in chapter 4, the individual rights is covered from an economics point of view. And the reason why the state part is very important is because for the first time in ever, to some extent, if you kind of discount the Mauryan Empire, Gupta Empire, the first time ever we have a modern kind of unified state of what is considered India, right? And that is that has immense potential and immense achievement, even already right now, because if you think about, the European Union is still trying to be a United States of Europe. And the reason why that is important is it gives you scale. So long as you can, what we write in chapter 4 and 5, especially chapter 5, is that if you can try to prevent the diseconomies of scale, the inefficiencies of gigantism, as we call it, then there is so much leverage you have, because in a world in which technology is increasingly winner takes all, right? We have these big tech companies in California. We have the Chinese state having their own kind of technology oligopolies. And if you are just a bunch of nations, if you were not one United States, you had no chance of competing against them from trade or technology point of view.
Yeah.
And then the final part is governance, foreign policy, defense policy, education, healthcare, local governance. So we try to cover a lot of that in the last two chapters.
Right.
So the reason why it's not just disparate, they're all connected, is because the civilizational state is a common part in all of them, right? So we want domestically, as you rightly mentioned, Claire Lehman's example, right? Our first default is also towards individual rights, but a lot of the book is about those boundary cases where that breaks down.
Exactly.
Whether it is economics or culture or civilization or trade policy or governance. So that kind of yin and yang is what makes, according to us, the book very interesting.
Right. So this schism and difference between the Bharat and the India aspect of things, right? I mean, we've discussed multiple ideas, topics, issues on Bharatvarta earlier, and we've referenced it a couple of times as well, that it's two modes of thinking. Whether you think India is a 5,000-year civilization, probably more, or you think India is a 70-plus-year-old country, right? Rajiv, how do you see some of these play out in everyday discussions, everyday ideas, everyday politics as such? A few examples.
Well, so one of the most striking examples recently is the debate around the CAA, right? The Citizenship Amendment Act. So what was the fundamental objection there of those who are against the CAA? They were saying that how can you exclude a particular religion? And that was the whole nub of the issue, that India is supposedly, allegedly creating religion-based sort of preferential treatment and so on. But the recognition that needs to come there is that there is a history of partition. There is a history of vivisection of what was Bharat in a larger sense, in a broader sense, along religious lines in 1947. And that partition actually didn't happen in a very thoughtful manner, as we have kind of explained in the book. So the person who actually was responsible for this, he had never set foot in the country, Cyril Ratcliffe. He's a person who never come to India, and he was very kind of blasé about, what would happen if he did his job badly, or if he didn't do it sort of with complete care. And the result of that was that many sort of non-Muslim religion people found themselves in theocracies after partition. So initially with Pakistan, and then later obviously with Bangladesh as well. So, and the life that these people have there, the non-Muslims in the Islamic theocracies, is not something, which is obviously, it's not great to be a minority in an Islamic country. And this is very well documented. There are all kinds of human rights violations. So India did the right thing here by saying that, India will be the home for these oppressed people. And by the way, the CAA does not change any kind of immigration or citizenship rights for Muslims from other countries, or even Muslims from the neighboring countries, the specified neighboring countries. All it does is it gives accelerated citizenship to those particular followers of those particular religions. But what was lost in the whole debate was, is India home for these people or not? And where would these people go? So those who accept that India is a civilization, home of these kind of oppressed people, oppressed minorities in Islamic countries, they welcomed CAA. They said that this was actually long overdue. And among those people were historically those who had supported action like this were people like Mahatma Gandhi. But in today's time, a lot of self-described secular politicians and so on, they continue to oppose it. Which is the fundamental reason for this is they don't recognize that India is a civilizational home, is a civilizational country.
And just to add to Rajiv's point, not just Gandhi as he mentioned, I mean the entire premise of the Nehru-Liaquat Pact was the idea that this partition has happened, and unlike Indian Muslims, for example, who at least had a notional choice, except what is now Indian Punjab, which includes Haryana, parts of Delhi, Himachal Pradesh. Most of the rest of Indian Muslims, for example, were not driven out of India, right? But whoever, especially in what was then West Pakistan and is now Pakistan, basically, especially in their Punjab, to some extent in the border Sindh regions, there was an exception. When they are the ones who are facing the brunt of the rapes of teenage girls, etc. They're in Tharparkar and Nagarparkar and all those areas. Basically, entire Pakistani Punjab was cleansed. And the idea was, okay, so these people did not have a right, these people did not have a realistic choice to say, okay, can we be minorities in what is now Pakistan? Or can we go to India? So anybody with any kind of economic means, in most cases, just do that, except a few Rajas, remained back. And many of them were later were treated badly even today in Pakistan. They say, they use these communities for cleaning toilets and stuff. So the idea that there was somehow Islam in the subcontinent has been emancipatory for caste divisions, just kind of that puts a lie to it right there. In fact, many communities, including the community called Churas, later be converted into Christianity. And if I'm not wrong, Yusuf Yohana is from that community, and who later then converted to Islam, became Muhammad Yusuf. So the idea is that you cannot say that we in 1947 we were invented out of nowhere. There is no history, for example, Chhatrapati Shivaji saying, Hindavi Swaraj. So he didn't say Maharashtrian Swaraj. He said Hindavi Swaraj. Right? What did that Hind mean when he was saying Hindavi Swaraj? Even the Arabs would say Al Hind Al Sind. So there is an idea. The Greeks wrote books like Indica. This is like 2,500, 2,300 years ago. And we quote Nehru, we quote him verbatim saying that, from the mountains to the seas, we had an idea of being the same country, even if we were politically divided or linguistically divided. And he gives a speech about that in Aligarh Muslim University in 1948. He gives another speech in 1961. So we are taking, again, the people who you would not expect to follow the civilization. I mean, you're not quoting Patel and all that. That's kind of, you would expect them to follow the civilizational construct. even people who you would not, including Nehru and Ambedkar, are very clear that this is a pre-existing civilization and culture. Ambedkar says, I'm not going to choose Islam and Christianity to convert my followers. I will choose Buddhism because it is in sync with India's culture.
Right.
So there is a clear element of a pre-existing, not polity, but civilization. And the word civilization is important. And we also write in the book, the word civilization and culture are often overlapping, but they're different. They're different in the sense that North India and Pakistan would, for example, have a lot of cultural commonalities in terms of the music you listen to, the food you eat, etc. But that is still skin deep, or maybe gastronomical deep, whatever is the right word there. But the moment you it is literally, we say it's the sharpest civilizational boundary on planet Earth today. We have a kind of polytheistic, syncretic culture civilization in India. You have one polity immediately to the west of it, which is trying to be holier than thou from a proselytizing Abrahamic point of view. And people are just being killed, not just for blasphemy there, but for potentially defending in a legal context some blasphemy, some so-called blasphemer. So you could meet people and speak Punjabi and have great time discussing Bollywood and food, but there is a clear civilizational and this is something that previous people who had discussed the idea of India, we quote Sunil Khilnani, in turn quoting Gandhiji. And especially we show the cognitive dissonance that somebody like Sunil Khilnani, great book. I'm not dissing the book's writing per se. And I just want to say for that, we are not necessarily, it's not an opposite idea. It kind of builds on the previous idea to some extent. But Sunil Khilnani is saying, he's saying, how do we explain partition? He's saying, should we think about it as one civilization breaking into two parts?
And he's almost confused by it, right?
Yeah.
It's almost like he doesn't know what to say because he almost sees it as a huge accident or something.
So the framework kind of breaks down, right? So what's interesting is in 1948, the Aligarh Muslim University speech in January 23rd, if I'm not wrong, just a week before Gandhiji was killed. So Nehru goes to Aligarh Muslim University and says, Aligarh Muslim University was the headquarters of the Pakistan movement, right? It is in Western Uttar Pradesh. He goes there and he says, past is what it is. Let's look towards the future. When I look at this beautiful civilization, I feel like I'm the inheritor of it. And then he says rhetorically, do you also feel it the same way? It's the reason I'm saying rhetorically because he knows obviously they do not feel the same way. These are the same people who literally led the movement just a year ago. But he's trying to be large-hearted.
After led the movement, they also voted for the League. They voted for the Muslim League.
Precisely.
Yeah. It was not a universal adult franchise. It was a limited franchise. But amongst that limited franchise, it was overwhelming vote for the Muslim League. In all these so-called Muslim minority Northern Indian provinces, as far as Tamil Nadu, what is now Tamil Nadu. So he's asking, do you feel the same joy and pride? Nehruji is asking these people. And, obviously it's a rhetorical question. And the point is, how do you then put it together? So if Kashmir is in a way kind of where it kind of, the rubber hits the road. So Indian kind of this nationalism hagiography, this Indian Congress kind of nationalism. So the reason I mentioned the Aligarh Muslim University speech is where Nehru actually says, if somebody were now to tell me to, Pakistan wants to reunite with us, I would say no. So he's saying this in January 1948. So he clearly understands, along with Patel, that actually being united does not work. Why? Because there is a certain kind of separate Muslim imagination, civilizational imagination, that basically breaks the Indian civilizational imagination. And it is only okay so long as the numbers are basically manageable, right? It's a modus vivendi.
Right.
That's what logically it means. So if that is the case, then the question is, okay, if the numbers are different over time or in a specific region like Kashmir, then what is actually the Indian imagination? Then the Indian imagination is something which actually we do not want to speak about, maybe in polite company. But if this is happening more and more often, then, it is time to perhaps speak about it more openly. So that is the civilizational state that we're talking about. Ronald Reagan once famously said, in his imagination of American conservatism, that libertarianism is the heart and soul of conservatism. But he says, I don't want to say that. Like he says, for example, corporate tax should be zero, but I don't want to say that. And in a way, the Nehruvian kind of understanding of nationalism was Hindu nationalism is obviously what is defining Indian nationalism, but let's not say it. And that kind of reminds me of Mao and Stalin, because Mao said, Mao famously warned against Han chauvinism while doing exactly that. And Stalin famously warned against Russian chauvinism while doing exactly that. It's just that Nehruji did not really have that kind of iron comparable to Mao or Stalin, and that's probably good. But somebody like Sardar Patel would have been a good balancer in that sense.
Right. So, I mean, that's a pretty compelling argument, and you won't have any opposition on that, and not from me at any rate, right? But how did this idea of the Sunil Khilnani idea of India become so ingrained in the popular narrative and discourse? Then, in that case, I mean, Rajiv, you could take this.
Well, I think it's a lovely phrase, right? It is actually Tagore's phrase. It's Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore's phrase. Firstly, I think it's a very nice phrase, the idea of India. Very catchy kind of a phrase there. So, and then I think his book is actually very well written. And those ideas which he presents in the book probably were not contested for a long time, which is why it had kind of a free run. So I think, and also obviously the governments of the day kind of imbibed or aligned with the ideas that Khilnani espoused. So in fact, you could argue that many governments actually took it too much in one direction, and even contorting even what Khilnani himself would have advocated. But I mean, that's a separate discussion for another day.
Right.
But yeah, I would say it just comes down to sort of a well-written book presenting a good thesis, and then the phrase, which is a very old phrase actually by Tagore. So it just caught the imagination for some time, I think.
So
Right.
just to add to that, I mean, I think the main point which Rajiv mentioned was it was not contested, right? So he put out this idea of India, and where he's basically saying that Nehru kind of created this idea of India. By the way, in the book, and we mentioned this multiple times, we do have some sunlight between Nehru and Nehruianism, just like we have between Gandhi.
Yeah,
And
that was interesting actually. Yeah.
And because what happens is, you kind of take dead people and you put your ideas into them. With the legitimacy of the name, right? I mean, and I'm not saying that the so-called right does not do it, right? And by the way, the left-right is also not a very useful thing. That's also we put in the book. But to add to Sunil Khilnani's point of view, see, I think that there was a certain kind of cultural hegemony of a certain kind of anglicized elite, which thought that this was genuinely the way to go. And you see, Sunil Khilnani, if I'm not wrong, he teaches in London. I don't know about recently. And there was an entire kind of commentariat and an academy. So India being so poor that all its leading kind of writers were not in India, just like its leading economists were not in India. It's leading, so Raghuram Rajan would fly down to become the central bank governor and then fly back, right? I mean, this is a municipality job to be the Reserve Bank of India kind of governor. And so there is an idea of that the metropole, the colonial metropole, is still alive despite formal independence of India. So this was the last generation of what they thought was they could somehow orchestrate the idea from above. And because it was not contested, a lot of the ideas which were being contested were not getting, for example, big publishers. Somebody like Sitaram Goel and Ram Swarup did excellent work, but their work has now been preserved more by their followers, well-wishers, and now published online. They never received big publishers as far as I know. In fact, if you go by Sitaram Goelji's biography, he'll say that he did not get an All India Radio gig because he said something against Nehruji. Famously, Kishore Kumar's songs were removed from radio and Doordarshan because he refused to sing at a youth congress function in the 1960s, if I'm not wrong. Right? So there was a certain kind of technology which led to a kind of monopoly with the dominant government or establishment of the day. And therefore, there was really no articulation of the opposite. And one of the things that Rajiv and I write in the book is it took P.V. Narasimha Rao's reforms, with back against the wall, and then Vajpayee's reforms more out of conviction than because of any emergency, although one can say Pokhran 2 was a bit of an emergency. And now Modi's reforms again out of conviction, which economic reform has led to a big middle class or a neo middle class, which along with technology have the free time, the intellectual capabilities to kind of get together and start writing. So even in our case, Swarajya is something which started as Center Right of India blog. You were doing an excellent job with Bharat Varta along with Ashish and other people, but it's new, right? You've gone to 100 episodes, you're doing a great job, but it's new. Everything is new in terms of our column writing, our platforms. So, and now we know a lot of people who are writing books, and we want to see more books. In a way, it could not have happened earlier because of various political and economic reasons. But now I think in the coming years, we'll actually see an explosion of contestation of not just this idea, our idea as well, and other ideas as well.
Right.
No, and especially, we were talking about reflexivity earlier. How sort of this kind of interface happens. So this is a classic case actually, where just kind of economic stagnation and complete sort of destruction of growth and so on kind of killed off the entire market, right? Which is why there was almost nothing happening in India in terms of ideas, at least in terms of presenting new ideas, because all those channels were blocked. They were kind of monopolized. And this was actually true till probably maybe, I don't know, 7 years ago, 8 years ago, or maybe you could say 10 years ago, where new writers got a chance to sort of come out and write books, and they found audiences who could pay 300 rupees for a book or 200 rupees for a book. Back in 1999, even if somebody wrote a book, how many people would actually afford to buy one? And how many people actually had the time to read?
Right.
So just on that point, go ahead, Rajiv.
Yeah. So, I mean, all these things kind of, which is why, so much of Indian sort of political thinking, philosophical thinking about what is India, what should be India, it was being driven from Piccadilly in London or from K Street in Washington, D.C., where, a small group of think tankers, analysts, professors, they had the time and bandwidth to sit and talk about India, whereas most people in India did not.
Right.
Just to add to that, this is a classic case of Indians rising up the Maslow's pyramid, right? So more and more people have time and monetary resources to even think about these issues, right? When you are literally a subsistence economy, hand to mouth for the vast majority of people, as you were probably till the 80s or early 90s, how do you expect a large number of people to spend time on these abstract issues? And then, as I said, technology, for example, I met so many people through social media, right? I mean, in a way, the Indian right wing, so to speak, again, left, right, whatever, for the moment, using it out of convention, the so-called neo-intellectual writing that's rising right now, they all know each other through social media. So what effectively was Khan Market as a physical meeting spot for the left liberal, as the Prime Minister is called, Khan Market gang. For the so-called right or center right, it was the internet, So you are in Bangalore right now. We are sitting in Kolkata. We've lived in Delhi or Mumbai or outside of India. That just made all those people getting each other, knowing each other, WhatsApp, Facebook, Twitter, completely possible. So so after the RSS, it is the RSS feed people. That's such a bad joke. which have actually led to this kind of groups being created, right?
Right.
So I think it really technology and more economic resources, and therefore rising up the Maslow's pyramid, has led to this.
No, so one testament to how deeply embedded that civilizational ethos is in the lived reality of India, right, is the fact that, despite 60, 70 years of quote unquote Nehruism, right, I mean, it has not gone away, right? So soon as people were able to talk about some of these things, had the wherewithal to do these things, engage in intellectual ideas, I mean, this is the first idea that's surfacing right now, right? And you and I and everyone else are a product of that per se, right? So one of the very interesting things that you talk about is this view on secularism, right? That it is the opposite of theocracy. Now, the other thing also is, and we hear this often, is this concept of dharma nirpeksh versus this philosophy of sarva dharma samabhava, right? I, for the life of it, have not been able to figure out how the state can privilege one thing over another, right? Essentially see some as individuals, some as group entities, and so on and so forth. I can't wrap my head around it, right? But Rajiv, would you like to talk about this? Maybe explain that in some context to us.
No, so as we write in the book, Roshan, we call it the pseudo-secularist fraud, and the reason I say it is a fraud is that what is actually being done in practice is the complete opposite of what the label is on the bottle and the intent of what you would think it is. For example, there are many states in India which are offering today religion-based welfare.
Mhm.
Many states are having different kinds of schemes. In fact, even the union government has some religion-based welfare schemes through the Minority Affairs Ministry. So what do these schemes do? They basically give out welfare sort of scholarships in education, other kinds of benefits and government benefits based on the religion of the person. So let's say if you're a minority person, which means if you're a Christian or a Muslim or Sikh or Parsi or something, you get these schemes. If you're a Hindu, you're denied these schemes. So is this reasonable? I mean, can we say the government is secular over here if the government has these kind of schemes? Which secular republic in the world offers schemes like this? So it is completely untenable actually to label these schemes as secular, but that is what has been going on, not for the last 10 years or 15 years, but for decades, where a variety of governments have basically entrenched discrimination and called it secularism.
Right. So, one of the amazing aspects of the book is, the words and phrases that you introduce, right? So, one of the things, I mean, I don't know if this is original or, neologism or it's borrowed it from somewhere. You call it minoritarianism, right? So, active minoritarianism as such. So, Harsh, you want to talk about that as such, where, these laws and regulations are being used actively to promote certain group interests as such?
Sure, I'll just get to minoritarianism in a second. I'll just add to the first question that you had asked about this term dharmanirpeksh. And so it's very important to clarify that, when we're talking about civilization, we thought that the best word which describes Indian civilization is dharma. So to be dharmanirpeksh is to basically be civilization neutral, right? In that sense. And if you're civilization neutral, you're almost neutered in a sense, right? So a lot of BJP leaders, a lot of intellectuals have said the right translation of secularism should be panth nirpeksh, which is, you are neutral to the specific path. Bahuvadan, forgetting the Sanskrit phrase where there are multiple paths that lead to the same
Ekam
God.
Sat Vipra
Bahudati. So, so that idea basically being there, fits perfectly well with panth nirpeksh, because then it's saying, we are agnostic to what specific path or spiritual fulfillment that you are following. But if you make it dharma nirpeksh, then you're saying that we are neutral to all ethics in a sense. And I think that is where the problem lies. The Sarv Dharma Sambhava is a classic case of that, right? Because then you're saying Abrahamic proselytizing religions, the two of them, and the various Indic paths are on the same plane in a certain sense. Now, maybe in front of the state, they should be. Yes, I would actually argue the fact that there are Abrahamic paths in a society makes the idea of separation of state and religious paths even more important, contrary to what some people think. But it is important to use the right language, because Indian secularism devolved into equal respect. Sarv Dharma Sambhava is often translated as equal respect. But the problem is there is nothing called equal respect, right? I mean, and
actually that is not the proper role of the government. What is equal? What is respect? I mean, always, like, what is equal respect? Someone can say this is not equal enough.
Exactly. I mean, the point is, no matter, even if you actually do want to sincerely offer equal respect, the chances of it being perceived as equal on both sides is basically nil. So that is an argument that will, by definition, lead to tensions, because both parties will not be satisfied, especially when both the parties have a very different worldview. So now coming to minoritarianism, as Rajiv mentioned, both the state government level, union government level, you have schemes like Nai Manzil, for example, under the Minority Affairs, the MoMA ministry, and often you have earmarked scholarships for minorities. Often the photos are given of Muslim boys and girls, often in very stereotypical garb, as if you go to the documents on the ministry website, as if young Muslim men and women, boys and girls, do not wear normal clothes. It's a very kind of an old Amar Akbar Anthony kind of representation mindset. Ye Muslim hai Chacha Jan, or ye hai Anglo-Indian Christian, and this is the Amar, who's the remaining Hindu. So there is an element of what we feel is, you're doing tokenism. You're spoiling the real meaning of minority, of secularism in a genuine sense. You are deriving poor Hindus, boys and girls, of these scholarships. In these scholarships.
Actually, also, Harsh, just to interrupt a little bit. So many of these programs are actually pushing those young people into learning and studying religious orthodoxy. So it is kind of depriving them of a modern education. Which,
for example, madrasa modernization. The thing.
Yeah. So I mean, here many governments are funding madrasa education, which is depriving minorities of a modern education, which kind of limits their options in a job, in a kind of a economy and a modern economy and a job market.
While at the same time, Hindu majority schools, except the linguistic minority ones, get placed under RTE and the 25% quota that Right to Education enforces on so-called majority schools. And these things, which have been kind of sanctified by constitutional amendments, which again the court did not strike down in its understanding of basic structure. We'll come to that later. So there is, as Raji was saying, you've completely inverted the meaning of secularism, whereby you have taken a Hindu majority school, you've put restrictions on it. You said you have to do certain things, even if you don't get a single paisa from the government. You've taken minority schools, whether it be leading Christian universities or colleges or madrasa schools at the bottom of the food chain, and you're giving them money while you're not putting any restrictions on them, and they can have religious quotas from 51% to 100% effectively, whatever it is. On what planet does that pass any sense of fairness test, justice test, reasonable test? I mean, it absolutely boggles the mind that this has been going on under our noses, and simply because a lot of people are not talking about it. And by the way, a lot of these Ministry of Minority Affairs was created as recently as under UPA.
2006, I think, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, so these things are not, it's not like they've been from the beginning of the Republic either. A lot of this is actually relatively recent. And because there is so much areas kind of fight this civilizational culture war, so to speak, the Modi government got re-elected, it did 370, it did CAA, that actually even the Modi government has not been able to undo the minority affairs kind of scholarship so far, at least. It's not like they don't know the issues. They have opposed it when they were, for example, when Narendra Modi was chief minister. So there is a lot of things to be undone under this garb of minoritarianism. And quite frankly, I don't think this actually helps the Muslim community as well. If you simply had a focus on providing good quality education in all areas, we've discussed that in the book also in chapter 4 and 5 in terms of school vouchers, school choice. Now I think education technology, EdTech will be a great boon in the years going forward, and coronavirus pandemic has kind of accelerated that process, as it has done with many other trends. So, this is nothing but tokenism, which divides society, does not lead to much benefits, and everybody feels dissatisfied. It's not like the Muslims are very happy with the BJP that, oh my God, aapne hamare liye nayi manzil scheme la di, and this is great. They're also unhappy. There is a understandable section of Hindu majority kind of, political interest groups, the people coming out with Hindu charters. They're, of course, also very understandably unhappy. So who's benefiting from this? It does not benefit anybody.
Right. Not to draw any parallels and kind of stretch the argument as such, right? But these kind of discussions are also happening in Europe, for example, right? With multiculturalism, where, governments are starting to treat privileged groups over individuals, appointing certain representatives as group heads, and them as being representative of the common person as such. Rajiv, I wonder if you could talk through some of those aspects. I mean, is this like a universal phenomena of the globalized world when cultures intermix and intermingle? These kind of resolutions that we thought we could leave for another day are coming to the fore at this point of time.
No, I mean, obviously, see, every part of the world, there's both the global sort of aspect of it, plus there are always regional, local issues which are bubbling up, right? Which, for example, in the US, race has been a very long-standing problem for them, like reconciling racial sort of problems and kind of bringing racial amity and so on. So they are dealing with their problems in a certain way. In Europe, there is the problem of, we call it a problem nowadays, but the problem of accepting basically non-white, non-Christian immigrants in a way. I mean, it's to put it bluntly, I think that's what it is in some of the European countries. So there was always this big question on Turkey joining Europe, and that would be kind of a litmus test whether the European Union can actually assimilate kind of a non-Western, kind of Christianized, if not Christian society, if that is possible. But ultimately Turkey hasn't joined, and obviously now it seems like impossible that it would ever join. But just some years ago it was on the table, and I think there is something to be said about the aspect of kind of globalization and even technology along with that, which is making cultures mix in a way which was just never happening in human history before.
Right.
The way people are moving around the world for work, for education, for even tourism, and these kind of interactions were just simply not on the table. They were never happening even probably 30 or 50 years ago. This is all very new. So different societies are dealing with it in different ways. You are right that somewhere the individual identity is being suppressed. Somewhere governments are finding it easier to take the route of box people into a certain group identity and then treat it as that. But my view is that will not be successful. Ultimately, it would have to be adjudicated at the level of the individual.
Right.
Just to add to that, a good person to follow on Twitter, friend of mine, is this American Pakistani doctor called Omar Ali, who runs Brown Pundits. And he, one of his famous blog posts is Islam the rock on which liberalism broke or failed? And you can add communist China to that as well. And these two are big trends which in a way have called into question many assumptions of liberalism. So just to add to Rajiv's point, not just non-white or non-Christian refugees or immigrants, but more specifically, for example, African and Arab Muslim refugees have been a problem in the European context. And just to show why that is the case, for example, if you read this guy called Theodor Dalrymple, who's a doctor come commentator, and I think that's his actually pseudonym. That's not his real name. And he writes, for example, if you look at even the Punjabi community in the UK, if you look at Hindus and Sikhs versus Punjabi Muslims from Pakistan, you see the rates of incarceration are like 10x, 100x. It's a huge difference. You compare Hindu Punjabis and Muslim Punjabis, the rates of educational achievements, the rates of employment, it's just huge. I mean, the reason why I'm kind of focusing on the Punjabi community is it seems like a natural experiment, right? You can say, Tamil Brahmins are doing very well. So can you really compare them to Punjabi Muslims? But even if you look at the Punjabi subset, there is a huge difference. And there is a problem, and even Macron, the French president, he has been saying it multiple times, he said it again, there's a problem of assimilation of certain Muslim groups, communities in Europe. He called it a parallel society, the attempt to run a parallel societies. And by the different countries have followed different models. So for example, I think in Britain, you have Muslim Council of Britain, but French has this laïcité kind of strict secularism model, perhaps even stricter and in some extent illiberal model of secularism compared to the US, but where you are only supposed to be French. Your communal identity is not supposed to be noticed by the state, not even in a census of any kind. So the French is like, kind of the tough model. Britain is the model where it bends. But irrespective of the model, the problems are in a way related to the ideas and the demographics. They're dealing it in different ways. But it is very clear that they are being forced to deal with it. And in a recent lecture, Macron said that, while we do not agree with what Hungary or Poland or even Russia is doing in terms of quote unquote far-right populism, he thinks there is, and the English translation is, there is a certain vitality, he says, in their civilizational self-confidence, which we need to think about. He also quotes India and China in that list, in a broader list. So there is a sense of they're trying to find something beyond Christianity, but which still keeps those Enlightenment values of seeing the individual while assimilating people who are at least at the first or second generation level, trying to have parallel societies, to use Macron's words. And these are global debates, and there is no one size fits all answers. But when you say multiculturalism has a very specific context in this as a state-led multiculturalism. But if multiculturalism in a societal sense, actually we write in the book that actually in many ways dharma is the original multiculturalism.
Absolutely.
And the reason why that sentence is important is dharma is about being syncretic. So who are we? There is a subsection in our chapter, who are we? India, the Bharat, the syncretic civilization. Like you'll have one version of Lord Ganesh in the south, one version of Lord Ganesh in the north. Somebody will be the brother of another god and the avatar of another god, and you'll connect to a local tribal god, and some group of local holy men will sanctify it, and before you know it,
and all of this keeps evolving over time, right? It's not
it changes over time.
Yeah.
Somebody like Tulsidas wrote the Ramayana. When he wrote it in the local language instead of Sanskrit, the Braj Bhasha, he was considered as a heretic, or at least not heretic is not the right word in the dharmic context, as heterodox, let's put it that way. But now that, Tulsidas's Ramcharitmanas is now the new kind of classic standard. So and Sri Ram is now in the last 1,000 years worshipped much more than the previous 1,000 years. So these things keep on changing in a very organic manner, which you can't really compare to these fixed doctrines. And so therefore, multiculturalism is not a wrong thing. It's when the state tries to officially have a multiculturalism policy. That is when the problems begin.
And that's a distinction between what we talk about in the book as salad bowl versus melting pot.
Yeah.
Yep.
So let's move to another facet of Nehruism. Gosh, it's a hard word to pronounce. I don't know how you wrote it so many times in the book, actually. So
Nehruvianism.
Nehruvianism. Okay, sorry. So let's move to another facet of Nehruvianism, which is the whole socialism aspect of it, right? Recently we had an episode on the labor codes that were introduced, and about Rishi Agarwal, who we had on our episode, literally, he gave us laws after laws after laws, which were so absurd. Some governing the way the top shelf of a canteen kitchen has to be cleaned, and so on and so forth, right? Absolutely ridiculous. Sorry?
I said Kafkaesque.
Yeah, it's just it would be comical if it wasn't tragic, right? So these kind of things, and implicit in the underlying principle is that sub businessman chore hai, right? So do you see that changing? Obviously, I personally see that changing as wealth becomes a lot more prominent, and we move up the social chain as such, economic prosperity and so on and so forth. But how do you see that changing, Harsh?
Well, I think attitudes are changing. We don't have great kind of longitudinal surveys in India, for example, Pew surveys, the way the US has. So I can't say with any kind of empirical certainty. But from just anecdotally, it seems to me that the youth are much more in favor of wealth creation. I don't think any kind of classical communist rhetoric, or even the way American millennials are reacting to, say, AOC or some kind of new left or far left rhetoric on economics, I don't think that has any salience here. And there are multiple reasons for that, right? Firstly, Indian per capita incomes have increased very dramatically in the last one generation. So everybody here is much more optimistic of their next generation being better off, whereas that has not been the experience for the median person in the West. So, so sometimes what happens is we just look at Western discourse and we try to copy paste it here, assuming because millennials there are unhappy with the 1% or whatever, and therefore the same thing must apply to India. That is not true in India. As I think Rajiv often very rightly says that if you look at Flipkart founders, etc., as opposed to the old businessmen, there is an element of aspiration and legitimacy as opposed to demonizing them. But I do think
actually my one-line answer would be, who do you think is the role model for a college student or a high school student in India today? Is it like Sachin and Bini Bansal, or is it Vijay Shekhar Sharma, or is it like some poet or some theater artist or some activist? Who's the role model? I think the answer would be pretty obvious.
I think the answer would be Swara Bhaskar.
So do people want to become Swara Bhaskar? Do people want to become Yogendra Yadav? Or do people want to become Vijay Shekhar Sharma or Sachin Bansal?
Right. So, we're coming towards the end of this part one of the part five series, right? And I must say, your book has a series of reviews, right, by this long list of people, right, left, center. I mean, you could find, sections and sections all across, right? So right from Shashi Tharoor to Amish Tripathi to Shekhar Gupta to the Honorable Minister Nirmala Sitharaman, Professor Jagdish Bhagwati, and so on, right? So really, how does it feel to get that kind of validation across the board? Because I mean, you guys are obviously talking about some contentious ideas, right? And even in the case of, I think one or two of these people, you might have very antithetical ideas compared to what views they hold as well, right? So how does that feel?
No, I think both of us are very grateful to have the recognition from them. Most of the people that we requested did accede to the request for giving a blurb, giving a comment about the book. They engaged with the manuscript, they engaged with the early draft, and were very kind to give the kind of feedback which they gave. And in some cases, I would say actually there is more commonality than it appears on the surface. So you could think that someone like Shashi Tharoor, for example, very very different, right? But I think my view is he's been trying to steer the Congress back on a certain path, and as we talk about in the book, as I think Swapan Dasgupta had written very eloquently on how the Congress was the party of Indian nationalism. It was the party of sort of the civilizational plank through the 50s and 60s, and over time it has kind of given up that path. That it was not India which gave up the Congress, but Congress which gave up Bharat. So I think people like him are trying to steer the party in a certain way, and even through his writings, like he's been trying to make the point about Hinduism and the culture of India, the civilization of India. So there is some commonality there. There is some commonality in terms of what I think all sides in India, or let me put it differently, all sort of thinking sides in India agree in terms of what needs to be done in terms of administrative reform, government reform, economic reform, and so on. So that I think there is plenty of commonality. Obviously, when the rubber hits the road with politics, people can do different things, but ideationally, at least I think there is a certain commonality.
Right. Okay. Where
anything to add on that?
Yeah, go ahead, Harsh.
Yeah. Just to add on that, I mean, while we have said it's a new idea of India, and in some ways it is, it's actually not that new. If you break the individual rights in a civilizational state, the original kind of constitutional kind of drafting committees did theoretically, did notionally, did normatively, to use the favorite word, have individual rights as the benchmark, right? I mean, even in the directive, we finally used it. And so directive principles also had an aim for uniform civil code, and that was put in by people of the broadly Congress party. And we must remember that the civilizational state, for example, the scheduled castes being limited to only dharmic communities, the quotas, as an example, or the Somnath Mandir being built at that spot where it had been destroyed and a mosque has been built, but not by Nehru, sure, but by Rajendra Prasad sanctified it. Patel and his followers made sure that it was actually made. So Congress was a much bigger, broad tent of various diverse intellectual opinions. So in that sense, while it's a new idea of India, we've kind of upgraded that basic theme. This is not a radically new idea in that sense, and not just 70 years. Individual rights is actually individual rights or duties, or just thinking in terms of individual salvation or moksha is intrinsic to dharma, right? Because if I cannot get my spiritual salvation as a family in the way Hinduism works, I have to do go through my own ashrams of life, and I have to find my own meaning in life. At the end of the day, it's very individualized. So unlike many other post-colonial societies, India uniquely kept its democracy. And it's the only functioning democracy from South Korea to Israel. Just think about it. Yeah. All of China, all of the Middle East, it's so problematic as of today while we are speaking in terms of any kind of political freedom. So, it is India, it is giant India that is holding up the flag of pluralism, individual freedom, individual rights. So we are not against individual duties. Or some people give us feedback, why not duties? Duties part comes in the civilizational context framework. So that is very much there. So we make a case for absolute free speech, but we have exceptions for that, so on and so forth. And to answer your original question, we are very grateful to everybody who gave the great blurbs that they did. But that's, as Rajiv was saying, because there's a lot of commonality. This is not a pro-BJP book. This is not a BJP apologia. This is a book that the way we see it. And if some other party wants to occupy that space, they can give competition to the BJP based on these ideas. That's perfectly fine. For example, even outside of war zones like Kashmir, BJP is not pushing for free speech to that extent. So we are not being completely apologetic about whatever the BJP is doing. It is just that we do think that Narendra Modi's prime ministership is fundamentally reconfiguring the Indian state in a way that is fundamentally net positive for both Indian economy and society over the long term. Right. But there are areas of disagreement, even if they are partial or minor.
Right. I've said this before. Before we started recording, that this book throws up a lot more questions than it gives answers, right? And it's a very essential part of what you're trying to do, which is a call to debate, a call to action as such. And these are ideas that we haven't really spoken about, or have wished it away for another time. But I think the time is right for us to talk through some of these things. Harsh and Rajiv, we're at the end of the podcast, and to end this podcast, if you were to look back on this book maybe 5, 10, 15, 20 years later, what is the one or two things that you would like for this book to have achieved? Maybe we can begin with Rajiv, and then Harsh can end it.
Well, I would hope that it actually raises those kind of questions more into the public domain. It kind of stokes those debates, and hopefully those debates get us to a better place. Bring about some more agreement in the overall polity. And by polity, I mean not just government, but even judiciary, even larger civil society, as to what is the kind of India we want over the next half a century or next century. And I mean, that's, I think, obviously nation building, one has to take a long-term view. So I do think that what we want to build flows out from the positions we take, and obviously the positions we take flow from the ideas that are there on the table. And hopefully, I really hope this volume will actually bring some of these ideas to the forefront. Hopefully, people will debate them enough, discuss them enough, and it will somewhere enter the consciousness of public discourse.
Right. Yeah, just to add to that, I think in a young country like India, and still developing country like India, except a few hardcore partisan people, I think most people are still largely undecided about their views, or they have some views, but they're flexible and ready to change, and actually much more open-minded than people give them credit for. So the one real aim of the book was to actually have a debate, or rather a discussion, because there are many books written from a kind of a left or center-left point of view, right? You have Pratap Bhanu Mehta's, Ramchandra Guha's, and other people who are writing books, editing anthologies. And there were not many books from a so-called non-left perspective, which just put out the views there. So I think a lot of people are not necessarily in social media. It seems everybody's fighting each other. A lot of people actually want to understand what the other side of view is, and then think, okay, well, maybe this makes sense, and maybe I agree here, and maybe I disagree here. So I hope that, while it's not a textbook, it's not exactly Indian politics 101. It's not exactly comparative politics 101 either. But I hope it is additional reading in many academic courses in India and abroad. I hope through word of mouth people read it and read different aspects of it. And maybe after 5, 10, 15 years, we learn where we were horribly wrong, where we were right. But I think the idea is to trigger discussions because ultimately, not everybody will become a partisan cheerleader one way or the other. If some people still have to go out and say, these are the ideas that constitute a nationhood, our civilization, and these are up for discussion, and this is where we stand right now, and we are open to changing our minds. And not just people who read it, by the way. I'm pretty sure Rajiv and I will also change some of our ideas. We definitely have changed some of our ideas in the last 10 years.
For sure.
So there's no reason. For example, trade is one aspect where we change. It's an interesting subsection in the book. So there are a lot of. I think we've not tried to write an orthodox book. It's heterodox in parts, and I think that's what made it very fun to kind of engage and write it as well.
Right. No, and I'll also say actually that we learned a lot as we wrote it,
yeah,
because we sort of researched so many different aspects of society, religion, economy, governance, that it was really an incredible learning journey for both of us.
Right. Okay, Harsh and Rajiv, this was a fascinating conversation. Always a pleasure talking to you both. So, on behalf of Swaraja and Bharat Varta, thank you so much for engaging with us, and all the best.
Thank you, Roshan. Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
Roshan. Thank you so much.
Thank you for tuning in. This podcast was brought to you by the team at Bharat Varta. If you liked this podcast, then don't forget to share, subscribe, and rate us on your favorite platforms. We're available on Anchor, Apple, Google, Spotify, Stitcher, Breaker, YouTube, and a host of other platforms. We started Bharat Varta to facilitate long-form discussions on politics, policy, and culture. We don't necessarily endorse anything that was said in this episode. If you do wish to offer us any feedback on the content or anything else, do reach out to us on social media or get in touch with us on our website, www.bharatvarta.in. The links are in the description below. Thanks again for tuning in. Until next time, stay safe, take care, and Jai Hind.